Okay, so now we're on to the fourth and I'm pretty sure actually final video for this time. I might have promised that last time, but things got a little bit long. We're going to talk some more about the Constitution. Now we're going to actually walk through the document itself. We've seen where it came from, what it grew out of, what questions it was trying to answer, why it was necessary, the debates that took place around it. And now we're going to briefly walk through it. We're not going to spend too much time on it because really a lot of what we're doing for the rest of the semester is focusing on it. Because as I said, the Constitution is the rules of the game. And so if we're talking about U.S. government, we're really talking about the U.S. Constitution. And so let's take a look at this. So what the U.S. government did, and we'll talk about this next week when we talk about federalism, but it set up a federal system of government. This is the first time in world history where this had happened. It took sovereignty, it took power, and it divided it between both a national government and a state government. It separated powers within the federal government. Instead of having one group be in charge, it had three separate co-equal branches, a legislative, executive, and judicial branches, each separate and independent, but each as powerful as the others. And it supplied this system we talked about of checks and balances, where they got to look over each other's shoulders and make sure they were doing their jobs and no one got too powerful. So we talked about this, separation of powers, all of that. So structure. How is the Constitution structured? Well, there's a preamble and 7 separate articles. What is a preamble? Preamble is a pretty statement of purpose. It doesn't really have any legal force. The first 3 articles of the Constitution are probably the most important for our purposes because they set up the government. The 4 remaining ones talk about the relationship between the states, national law, and how to amend and ratify. A couple of fun facts before we get going. The U.S. Constitution is the oldest and shortest written national constitution in the world. That's pretty cool. So we think about the U.S. as being a very young country. But technically, the U.S. is actually one of the oldest countries in the world because we have, thanks to the strength of our Constitution, been able to maintain our system of government longer than pretty much any other government. Every other government has had to make major changes to their government to keep up. The U.S. has been able to rely upon this wisdom from our founding fathers to maintain a system of government that has worked. 2 of the big names, Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, were not able to sign the Constitution. They were on France and Great Britain on diplomatic missions. And the first Thanksgiving was not to thank the Pilgrims, but rather to give thanks for this new Constitution. Okay, there's the preamble. You've heard it a million times. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common events, to promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. Now, it's important to note that's the only time the United States of America appears in the Constitution, so that's how we know what the name of our country is. And really what they're doing is saying, this is what this document is all about. These are the purposes. And we talked about this when we talked about the purpose of government. This preamble spells out why we have a government. What was it they were trying to do with this? Now, legally, the preamble doesn't have an effect, but as a practical matter, it helps us to understand the goals, what the Founding Fathers were trying to do. Okay. Now, the big 3, these are the 3 articles in the government, the big important ones. Article 1 sets up the legislative branch, 2 sets up the executive, 3 sets up the judiciary. Now, we're going to go over these in detail as we move forward. We're going to talk about the legislative branch first, and the reason we talk about the legislative branch first is because it's the first branch of government. By design, although all 3 branches were equal, the legislative branch was really the most important, because it was where law came from. Law came from the legislative branch, was enforced by the executive branch, and was interpreted and applied by the judicial branch. But the legislative branch was designed to be the linchpin, the most important, the first branch. That's why it's first. Now, of course, that's no longer the case in our country. The executive branch has grown and has taken over many of the legislative, and as we'll talk about later, many of the judicial functions of government as well. So, but for the purposes of the Constitution and understanding our country, remember that Article 1 is the legislative branch, and the legislative branch was, by design, the most important. Article 4 contains the full faith and credit clause. Full faith and credit means that the orders of a court in one state apply in all the states. So, for example, if I issue a order saying that you have to stay 100 yards away from your ex-wife in Texas, if you move to California, can they make that order apply? And the answer is yes, there's ways to do that. Now, this became a big issue a few years ago, several years ago now, I guess, with same-sex marriage. Prior to the Obergefell decision, there was a big question as to whether or not marriage that takes place between a same-sex couple in Vermont under the full faith and credit clause has to be recognized in the state of Texas. So this full faith and credit clause kind of came to the front. Lots of people said, yes, you have to recognize same-sex marriage because of the full faith and credit clause. A lot of other people said, no, marriage is a state issue, we're not going to do it. Obergefell kind of stepped around it and said, same-sex marriage has to be allowed everywhere in the country. So we don't really care about the full faith and credit clause. Same-sex marriage is the rule. And so it didn't really answer that Article 4 question, but the question was asked. That also it contains the privileges and immunities clause called the comity clause, which is different than comedy, ha ha ha. It just sounds similar, which basically means you have to treat citizens of other states the same as you treat citizens of your state. So if a Californian moves to Texas, which they all like to do, we have to treat them just like we treat other Texans. So this means you have the right to travel between states, you can go into courts in other states, you can own real estate in other states. They can't impose special taxes on you for being out of states. There are limits on this. For example, hunting licenses, you don't have to grant the same to people in Montana as people from outside of Montana. Now, one of the big ones that comes up every few years is school tuition for colleges. So the tuition you pay if you live in California and want to go to UT is much higher than the tuition you're going to pay if you live in Texas and want to go to UT. Now, doesn't that run afoul of the Privileges and Immunities Clause? This has gone all the way up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said no. Why? Well, they said that the taxes you pay as a state citizen helps to pay for those schools, so it's okay for them to treat people from out of state differently. Now, of course, that's a horrible decision because the taxes you pay as a citizen pay for everything in the state. So, applying that logic, the comity clause has no effect whatsoever. So, what really happened? Well, what really happened is UT can hire a bunch of really good lawyers, and they want to charge out-of-state people more, and so they hired really good lawyers, and they got them to argue for them, and they won the case. So that's why they can discriminate on tuition despite the fact that it's unconstitutional. Okay. Article 4 also has the fugitives have to be returned, and it also had the fugitive slave clause, which said that if a slave ran, it had to be returned. Article 4 deals with admission of new states. When can they be admitted? How can that happen? Gave power to Congress over territories. This is a very interesting video. I suggest you watch it. It's over the territories. U.S. territories it's a very complicated issue. They're not granted full citizenship rights, and what rights they do have vary based upon which territory it happens to be. And so it's an interesting video that sort of explores that. It's an area of U.S. law that really does need to be cleaned up. We either need to start granting citizenship or not granting citizenship or cutting people loose or at least making a unified law for it. So I highly recommend this video linked down here. So watch it. Okay, Article 4, Section 4 basically says that U.S. government shall make sure every state has a Republican form of government. It obligates the federal government to protect us from invasion or from domestic violence. That doesn't mean spousal violence. That means uprisings within the states. Article 5 deals with the amendment process. We will go over this more, but it's a very fascinating subject. Basically, we've stopped doing amendments to the Constitution because it's really hard to get through. We found other easier ways to just let the government do whatever they want. But this is how they're supposed to amend the Constitution now. So you have to do two things. You have to propose an amendment, and you have to ratify an amendment. There are two ways to propose an amendment, and there are two ways to ratify an amendment. So for proposal, either 2/3 vote in both houses of Congress can propose an amendment, or Congress can hold a national constitutional convention, which is called by 2/3 of the state legislatures. Now, every constitutional amendment that has ever happened in the U.S. has happened because of the first option, 2/3 vote in both houses of Congress. The second option has never happened since the Constitution. Why not? Well, the last time we had a constitutional convention was when we threw out the Articles of Confederation and made a brand new government. So there is a legitimate fear that if we call a new constitutional convention, the end result will be the U.S. Constitution is gone completely and we have a brand new government. So that's something people aren't very willing to do. Now, I will tell you that in recent years, there has been a push, particularly by Republicans, to call a new constitutional convention to answer many of the questions that they feel are unanswered by the Constitution. It's an interesting thing. So, after you propose it, you then have to ratify it. You have to make it the law. So how can you do that? The usual method is the legislatures vote, and if 3/4 of the state legislatures vote in favor of it, then it becomes law. You can also have the people of the states vote, and if 3/4 of the states vote for it, you can have it. That's only happened once for the 21st Amendment. But Article 5 deals with how do we amend. This is a great video. This is a Simpsons video. I, again, highly recommend it. It's a funny little video about how an amendment becomes law. Unfortunately, I can't play these things since I'm teaching this on YouTube. If I tried to, they would simply flag this and take down the entire account. So there you go. Article 6 says that all debts from before the adoption of the Constitution are valid against the U.S. This is a big deal. Basically, the federal government wanted to take on the debts of the states because the theory was that if we owe people money, they're going to be more likely to loan us money because they need us to pay them back. It sounds a little bit tortured, but that was the idea, and it's pretty much held to be true. So France had loaned Virginia money. France didn't want to loan the United States money. But Virginia was able to say, well, I'm giving all of my debts from the Revolutionary War to the new federal government. So now the new federal government owes France money. So France now really, really wants the new government to succeed. And so to do that, they will loan more money. That was the general idea. Supremacy Clause basically says that the Constitution and federal laws are the supreme law of the land. I went into a lot of detail. I'm not going to expect you to know that for this. Paragraph 3, people who want to represent the state, represent the federal government, have to swear to uphold the Constitution. Also, no religious test shall ever be required. Now, that was an interesting one. You've seen probably the president swear in. He'll put his hand on a Bible. Sometimes he'll say, so help me God, or whatever. That's not actually required under the U.S. Constitution. Many state constitutions require it, but there was actually a case in 1997 that said that although state constitutions require it, the federal Constitution does not allow for it. So you can't force people to say, so help me God, or swear to God that they will uphold an oath of office, or that they have to be a Christian or whatever to hold public office in the United States. So it's interesting, you'll find many state constitutions still have those provisions. They're just no longer enforceable. Article 7, as we talked about, dealt with the required 9 of the 13 colonies to ratify it. And that is our Constitution. So, when we talk about the Constitution, it's frequently referred to as a living document. But what does that mean? And there's a number of things that can mean. The first is it's simple enough, a statement of fact. The Constitution is a living document because it is a document that can be amended. So it can be changed. So some people, when they say it's a living document, that's what they mean. It's been amended 27 times. There's new amendments being proposed all the time by people, not so much by Congress. So it is more or less a living document. But of course, constitutional amendments are very hard and very unlikely to be passed. So maybe that's not a great example of how it's living. Other people say it can be amended by judicial interpretation. We've seen many of the most important steps in our society in the past several decades, for better or worse, have come out of the Supreme Court. So we see Roe v. Wade, Planned Parenthood v. Casey. We saw the Obergefell decision on same-sex marriage. We see that even though the words of the Constitution haven't changed, our interpretations of those words have changed through court decisions. We also see changes in social and cultural change. For example, what is cruel and unusual punishment? It's forbidden by a constitutional amendment. There can be no cruel and unusual punishment, but that's not defined. And so what classifies as cruel and unusual punishment has changed over time based upon our social and cultural ideals. Also, technology changes can change the definitions in the Constitution. For example, Second Amendment right to bear arms. Does that mean I can have a nuclear weapon? Does it mean I can have an automatic weapon? What about this? Searches and seizures, unlawful searches and seizures under the Constitution. How does that apply to internet activity? Or if the government can use a Stingray, that's a brand name tracker, to track my cell phone activity and be able to say, everywhere I go throughout the day, can they do that without a warrant? Has the technology basically invalidated our constitutional protections? Okay, that is the end of part 4 and the end of our lectures for this week. Thank you very much. Make sure that you go ahead and comment on the discussion board and that you take the quiz so I can get you credit for all the activities for this week. Thank you.